Write sappy words, act out of character, create catchy melodies, or buy expensive rocks. Love. Why? We are made for love. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or your relationship status, love is part of life. You look for places to receive it and to give it. You want to love and be loved because you are made for love.
Good morning, I think. Good morning. I bet I'm on. Listen, I just want to start by saying that I'm mad. I love a good session of singing, of worshiping the Lord through singing, especially when it's like cry night at camp. You know what I'm saying? But I'm mad that I have to preach after it happens. I'm back here ugly crying, just snotting everything. Miss Terry up here giving the Lord her all. I'm tight. So hopefully the Spirit keeps moving, or else I'm going to just fall out, okay? So let me just say, y'all give it up. Y'all give it up. So last time I was up here, I was telling everybody about my first date with Brittany. That whole process, how she rejected me, everything that happened. I was kind of, letting everybody know about my shameful no that I got, but then the win. You got to stay with it. So I was able to get her to say yes, but then our first date turned into more dates, a ton more conversations. Eventually we paired off. We met each other's people, and we're staying in community together. We did that for about 2 or 3 months before that sickness, Pastor Jerry, last week started to set in for me. I didn't need to go to the doctor. I knew what it meant, that my nose was wide open. I was love struck. I was sprung. I'm going to just call it like it is. And I woke up one day and recognized that I didn't want to wake up a single day without her. I wanted Brittany to be my morning routine. Like Daniel Caesar said, "You're the coffee that I need in the morning." I'm going to let y'all sing. But that's what it was for me. And so I did the whole common practice thing. I spoke to her gatekeepers, namely her parents. I bought a ring. I planned a little get-together. And after 4 months of dating, which is quick, but it's fine, it worked for us. After 4 months of dating, I hit a knee, and I asked Brittany to spend the rest of our lives together. And she didn't reject me. Here we are. And so we had what you could consider an expedited engagement process. We were only engaged for 4 months. We planned a wedding in 4 months. Shouts out to Brittany and those who helped her. They carried the majority of that. But it didn't take long, literally or metaphorically, for us to get to November 20th, 2016. The day came, and I woke up on my wedding day. And I'd slept terribly because I think we were all like crashing at a friend's house, and so I slept on the floor, and I just was hurting. Everything was terrible. But we started the journey to the altar for me that day, and one step in that process was putting on this suit. It fit me a little better then. All right, these pants are a little tight. Stop looking. All right, keep the camera wasting up today for me. But I was gearing up, and all of that, I was gearing up to carry the weight of love. Her alarm was going off, if you will, and it was time for her to be awakened. Last week, Pastor Jerry described love as a weight, a burden, this uncontrollable force. He talked about letting her sleep, let her slumber. And he explained that God's given us this positive gift, but because we can't handle it on our own, because it's too much for us, that it comes with a caution, that we shouldn't awaken love prematurely. We shouldn't force it, we shouldn't manufacture it, and we shouldn't be so consumed by the desire for it that we make unhealthy concessions. That's what he was saying last week, that we can't simply dip our toes into love. You can't just control it. You can't play with it. It's not a toy. It will control you. It will get the best of you. And our God is the only one capable of properly awakening love, of bringing order to the otherwise chaos of these emotions and this experience and this environment of love. hold on to that idea of God bringing order. I'm going to weave that throughout the entire morning. But the reality is we need God's help. And so what we're going to look at this week is the help that he gives. When it's time to awaken love, when her alarm is going off, God has provided her with a morning routine, if you will. And this morning we're answering the question, how do you awaken love? How do you awaken love? What is the proper procedure for becoming a permanent participant in love, specifically in the context of marriage, which we will talk about today? We're continuing our Made for Love series. We've got just a couple more weeks of it, and we're picking back up in chapter 3, verse 6. You can turn there, or it'll be on the screen, but I have to give a little bit of a preface, like a viewer discretion advised message. I don't mean to sound like Dave Chappelle on purpose, but you better not bring your kids. So if you have children who are young and you have not had conversations, you're not ready to have certain conversations, we will handle the topic this morning. I just want to give you time to pause. We will handle the topic this morning of sex. We're going to handle it prudently and shrewdly. We're going to honor it and revere it. It will not be flippant. But there will be terms, there will be topics that may be uncomfortable for you as a parent if your kids are not ready for that yet. What we're going to find in this passage is some practical wisdom that fits into the process of awakening love, into that timeline. But what we're going to do is we're going to zoom out. After we kind of address this wisdom, this insight, we're going to zoom out and we're going to see through the window of the text to the God who is behind the text. And we're going to see something that's really encouraging, regardless of where you are. If you're waiting to awaken love or if you're off in the deep end, if you're wandering around and you feel frustrated with your singleness, or if you're feeling isolated in your marriage, both are possible. And wherever you are, this text is for all of us, I can assure you. And here are the moves this morning: ceremony, Sabbath, consummation, and then some consolation at the end. I'll give it to you again. Ceremony, Sabbath, consummation, and then a little bit of comfort to go out with. So let's start with ceremony. We won't read it, but let's look briefly together at chapter 3, verses 6 through 11. Notice in verse 6 that something is stirring out in the wilderness. There are these expensive incenses that are billowing up, and it's causing this very unique sight and smell. In verses 7 and 8, you find out who it is that's coming out of the wilderness. It's Solomon, and he's squatted up, right? Like he's rolling deep in with all of these guys. It's depicted that they're like his secret service or his royal guard. It signifies the position that he's in. And this military escort represents the safety, the security, and the protection that the bride feels with her groom. In verses 9 and 10, it says that the Shulamite woman is describing his palanquin. I think that's the term. We don't really have those, so if you're like, I don't know what that is, it's like one of those mobile carriages that you carry somebody in on. So Solomon's laid out on this like decorated, decked out mobile bed, if you will, being carried in. And why? Why is all of this stuff happening? Verse 11 tells us, look there, it says, "Go out, O daughters of Zion," or Jerusalem, "and look upon King Solomon, with the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of the gladness of his heart." Solomon is showing up for their wedding. That's the reason for all this extravagance. Their dreaming, their distance, all the waiting that they have done is over. And the bride yells out, "Behold, look, y'all, there he is. He's coming. The day is finally here. Our big day has arrived." And there's an excitement that builds over the course of the passage. It's signified by this gap, right? He's way out there. What is this? I can't really tell. And the gap is slowly closed and then crescendos with the occasion of this poetic description. The couple has made it to their wedding day. And there are a few things that I want to point out here, all right? To start with, they absolutely blow out their budget. Like, this is crazy. You got gold and silver everywhere, all over everything, all the most expensive things that money can buy. They were cutting no corners. This wasn't some DIY energy in the dollar section. They turned it out. But not everyone has taxpayer money to foot the bill of their big day like Solomon had, all right? Which is assuming a lot. But this text isn't encouraging a big budget. That's not the point of what's going on here. It's speaking to the significance of the moment. A wedding isn't about what you spend, it's about how you make it special. Now, you don't need to buy into, pun intended, the commercialized nature of weddings in our society. That isn't necessarily wrong, but that's not what the text is encouraging. It's not saying you need to go to the nines. The text simply portrays a celebration suitable to the occasion and your means. That's what's being communicated here. Whether you're in a backyard or the biggest venue you can find, if you take a couple of your closest people to the courthouse, or if you invite everyone you've ever met and people that you haven't even met yet, like, hey, come to the wedding, whatever it looks like, the premise is celebrating. And speaking of who you invite and who's involved, there's another aspect to this. In verse 7, the bride is addressing someone who she explains in verse 11 is these daughters of Zion. Like the ladies she's been addressing throughout the entirety of the book, it's the same audience, like her bridesmaids, if you will. And Solomon was parading in with his guys, almost like groomsmen, if you will. And what they were doing was coming to get the bride. It was common practice of the day. The text also mentions that Solomon's mom constructed this crown to put on his head. The point being that this is deeply communal. The family and the friends are involved. They are participating. This is a public and an official moment. Weddings in Israel involved the local town elders, like local leadership. It would happen in homes and outside, and everyone would be able to see it. And it was the culmination of both families participating in the arrangement of this marriage. Everyone was involved together. It was deeply communal. I point that out to address a couple of things that I've heard recently or over the course of time. One of them is this phrase, maybe you've heard it, we're married in God's eyes. Have you ever heard someone say this? Okay, I've also heard someone recently suggesting this idea that it's weird to get the government involved in your relationship. Like, I love you so much, let's get the government involved. And to some extent, I hear that, but there's just a slight issue that I kind of want to address biblically. It's not a personal opinion, it's just, I really think that it is negligent if you're not careful. It neglects the idea that God brings order to chaos, right? This book is constantly referencing back to Genesis 1 and 2, and there it portrays God as the one who brings order both to the creation and to civilization. He's depicted as, creating marriage. And it's this boundary delineating the microcosm, the smallest unit of a society. It demarcates families. These people belong, we all belong together, but these people belong together, and these people belong together. And more than that, marriage also distinguishes the proper context for sexuality, which is where the whole we're married in God's eyes is usually utilized. What that person is saying is that it's okay for us to engage in sexual activity because we're going to get married, because we're already committed to each other. So God's going to understand. But the thing that's hard about that is that God has told us the order that he's brought to that chaos. He has communicated the boundaries that protect us, that help us, and that honor him. So we don't get to subvert that order based on our desires, because God has communicated what he desires. And so this communal involvement happens at the ceremony, for sure, but it also includes becoming one flesh civilly or legally. And so the other part of this that I want to say is if you're struggling sexually, 1 Corinthians 7 is abundantly clear. Don't be burning. You know what I'm saying? It says, get married. That's the point. And so we want to say, not only is there no shame in this, we celebrate this. Before the party that you've planned, the ceremony, whatever, grab your closest people, get your marriage certificate, and elope before everything goes down. The reason we say that is because this book and the entirety of the scriptures elevate purity. It makes much of finishing well, following the order that God has set apart, that he has given us. It means following this morning routine for awakening love. And there's more to it than a ceremony, which is the next step in the order. It's Sabbath. So we have a ceremony and then we have Sabbath. Say Sabbath. Sabbath, that's right. Which might sound strange at first. You're like combing through the text like, I don't see it. Where is it? But hear me out, okay? Sabbath is communicating this idea of rest. And you cannot rest if you're preoccupied, if you're moving from thing to thing, if you're always in a hurry. And so this point has some layers to it that I want to break down, but all of those layers connote this idea of slowing down, of resting. And so Sabbath means slowing down enough to celebrate each other. Say celebrate. Celebrate. Now there, in the first 7 verses of chapter 4, so chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, there's some cultural background here. So the Song of Solomon is very similar to Egyptian love poetry and Assyrian love poetry, Babylonian, like other ancient Near Eastern societies had love poetry. And some of them had these specific types of songs called wasifs. Now, don't ask me to spell it. Don't ask me to pronounce it properly. I don't know. But what it is a specific type of song, like a haiku poem. It's a poem, but it's a different type of poem. It has a structure. Similarly, the structure here is in verse 1, there's an introduction. In verse 7, there's an outroduction, if you will. It's not the way that you say that, but whatever. It's an outro. And in those, the groom is providing a summary statement, parentheses, if you will, and saying that in between is this praise of his bride with this very specific content. So look in verse 1. You can underline these or number them if you want, but he starts with her eyes, and then he goes to her hair, and then he says something about her teeth, her lips and her mouth in verse 3, her cheeks, her neck, and eventually her breasts. And the metaphors here are a little bit antiquated, all right? They don't translate well for us. Like, I'm not going to run up on Brittany today and be like, say, I like the dress you're wearing. And also, man, your teeth look like sheep. You know what I'm saying? You're bad, sis. Like, I don't think that's going to work with my wife. Like, I just don't think that that's a good move. And honestly, if you were to paint the portrait of all the metaphors that he gives, this girl's not a beautiful woman. But that's not the point. The point isn't that you literally look like goats and sheep in a tower. The point is that she makes him feel the same way he feels when he sees these things out in the world. He's communicating that her beauty is causing a visceral response. There's a twofold thing going on here. He's singing over his bride. He's celebrating her. But secondly, notice that there's a downward progression to his praise. He is slowly taking delight in all of his bride. I love that this signifies observation, not objectification. He is appreciating her beauty. He's drinking her in. It's one of the strengths of going slow, that it's not just about what happens at the end, it's about the entirety of what's going on here. He is celebrating her. It's not the only thing. Sabbath means slowing down enough to receive each other, not just celebrating the beauty, but receiving it as a gift from God. Notice, they're not sprinting towards sex, right? They're not in a hurry. And they aren't just celebrating what's attractive about each other. They're receiving the gift of their spouse one step, one physical feature, one affirmation at a time. Solomon ain't trying to hustle or bustle, all right? He's not in a hurry. Look at verse 6. He even says, until the day breathes and the shadows flee, I will go away to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. Now, I'm going to let you put 2 and 2 together on what that mountain range is, but notice that he's saying we have all night. We're not going anywhere. We don't have any need to hurry. You see, excitement doesn't necessitate expediting the process. All right? They slow down, and we should slow down enough to receive, to delight in all of each other, to celebrate, to receive. But then Sabbath also means slowing down enough to rest together. Now, you may have already noticed this, but he praises 7 specific things about his bride. And 7 represents this number of completion, of perfection, of something being whole in the scriptures. This 7 piece here is a hyperlink back again to the garden, to Genesis chapter 1. Solomon is echoing God. When God's describing creation as good, 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 very good, that's what Solomon is doing here for his bride. He's saying that she's good. This is good, very good. He's saying their love has culminated in covenanting to love one another for the rest of their lives. But one more thing, he's saying that they've done it well, that they have followed God's order, that God is the one that set this up, sustained it, and is now affirming it in the way that they've gone about it, which, if you remember, was what the Shulamite was doing in chapter 1. But thinking about that creation account, do you remember what happened on day 6? Excuse me, day 7. They rested. God rested, and that's the last layer of this. They can rest with each other. They've done the work, and now it's time for them to rest. Now, the book portrays that marriage takes work, and all the married folks out there said, I heard somebody back in the AVU room. I hope it wasn't Jorge. Abby, he loves you. Just marriage takes work, right? Marriage takes work. But for now, they're making space to simply rest together. After the ceremony, they stopped their normal routines. They took a vacation, and they started their marriage off with a Sabbath of sorts. You see, in Israel's context, it was more communal in nature. And so for them, what happened was they had like a week-long feast, right? With family, with friends, with neighbors. It's a little bit different. I don't think that any of us would be like, we're going to have our wedding celebration, and then for the next 7 days, we're going to hang out with all of those people. Like, I don't think that's what any of us would necessarily want to do. It's culturally different. In our context, it looks more like a honeymoon, if you will, which doesn't mean that you've got to hop a plane and drop all this money on a trip. It simply means slowing down enough to create space to rest together. Brittany and I are by no means, heroes, but just as an example, after our ceremony, we left our wedding, drove 30 minutes, and stayed 3 days in Fort Worth. Now, Fort Worth is cool, right, Danita? Yeah, Fort Worth is cool. I like Fort Worth. I grew up outside of Fort Worth. It's like home. But when you think about a honeymoon, you may not think like, I'm going to go around the corner, stay at places mad familiar. Like, that may not be the typical thing. But for us, it wasn't a long stay. We didn't go very far. We didn't spend all that much. The point was we carved out time and space to slow down, to debrief the events of the past few days, to drink each other in and celebrate each other, to get to know each other in this very new context, and to rest. Giving yourselves a posture of slowing, a space for slowing, and a goal of resting will help you as you prepare for the last point. After the ceremony, as you Sabbath, there's consummation. And you can see that the slower paced downward progression continues, starting again in verse 8. When the groom continues and he says, "Come with me from Lebanon, my bride. Come with me from Lebanon. Leave that peak of this mountain and leave this peak of this mountain. Leave where the lions and the leopards live and come with me," to kind of summarize the rest of that. And maybe you remember from last week's sermon and in chapter 2, but the Shulamite woman also wanted time with him all night long. If you look in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, "Until the day breathes and the shadows flee," which he just said in chapter 4, verse 6. If you look in chapter 2, verse 10, she's daydreaming about him running up and stealing her away. She's daydreaming about him saying to her, "Arise, my love, my beautiful one, come away with me." And here in chapter 4, verse 8, he says, "Come with me. Come away with me." It's this idea of their desires being fulfilled, of dreams coming true. What she's wanted from him and their relationship in the past, what she's daydreamed about experiencing, he's now providing in the present, and there's this reciprocity. There's this development that's been happening that lands at this moment. This deep excitement, this tension and this passion continues to build over the next few verses. But it isn't just sexual, it's deeper than that. It's intimate, it's emotional. Notice that he just addressed her as my bride. That's the first time he says that. He says it 6 total times in this passage. And he uses this, in Hebrew it's a prefix, but in English it's a word, my. He uses the word my about 20 times in this passage. And what he's communicating is this deep sense of belonging with each other and to each other. They are safe, they are united, and they're benefiting from the gift of covenant and the oneness that comes with it. And I'll get to that a little bit more soon. But he also calls her sister. It's this term of endearment. And twice he tells her, you have captivated my heart. I'm caught up in you, girl. Like I'm losing it. You've got all of me. It only took one jewel, and you have all the jewels. He's vulnerably opening himself up to her. These newlyweds are experiencing emotional intimacy, this deep connection and chemistry that's fitting for a couple that's in covenant. It's also another reference back to the garden. Solomon and the Shulamite, following the order that God's established, are now naked and unashamed. They're together as if it was the pre-fall state, before sin entered the picture and selfishness entered the picture. It's like God is enabling them to experience Eden all over again, even in the exile of a world tainted with sin, which overflows and is expressed both physically or sexually. You see in verse 11 that they're kissing enough to taste the promised land under each other's tongues. They're exploring each other enough for Solomon to find out that she's a virgin in verse 12. He explains that she's been this private garden that no one has had access to, but God's now given this to him to fully enjoy. And notice there's not a tree that's forbidden. There's no fruit that's off limits. That God wants them to experience the fullness of delight in each other. She's, in his estimation, she's this fountain, this spring, this river of living water, which is a metaphor for the waters that come up in Eden. They bring life. And when you look throughout the scriptures, you see this all over the place where God is giving glimpses of Eden to people. These waters spring up and they give life. I mean, think of all the times throughout the scripture where you see a relationship starting by a well or like a healing happening at a river, that these waters are depicted as giving life. And it's as if heaven, as if God himself is kicking down the door of earth and saying, here I am. Take this from me. I'm the one who brings order to chaos. He's good. If you continue to carry this forward, you look at Proverbs 5. It describes sexuality in terms of life-giving water as thirst and drink. And the author is urging the wise to drink water from their own water supply. And it's described that a spouse is enough water supply to fill the streets of the city, to fill the houses and make people have to be on top of their roofs. That's the picture of Proverbs 5. But marriage is the boundary, the order that God gives for these untamable waters. And so now this endless, limitless water supply is all yours. This wonderful gift. And if the metaphor here in Song of Solomon is more literal than theological, then what you can see is that all of their affirming, their inviting, their kissing, their touching, it culminates in the couple being primed for consummating the covenant, which they do now. If you look at verse 16, I differ from the ESV, which is what I'm reading, and I think that she says all of verse 16, but let's read it. She says, awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind, blow upon my garden, let its spices flow. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its choicest fruits. A lot of things going on there, pretty racy, but the one thing that I notice first and most about this verse is the very first word. What is it? It's awake. Remember, the caution has been, don't awaken love, don't awaken love. But here, the bride sounds the alarm. She's awakening love. It's time to come out of the slumber. And the bride says, yeah, I was a locked garden, but now you're the only one with the key and I'm all yours. And then here in chapter 5, verse 1, Solomon responds in the past tense. So there's a gap between chapter 4 and 5 that you can fill in for yourself. But he says, I came to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gathered my myrrh with my spice. I ate my honeycomb with my honey. I drank my wine with my milk. Last week, Pastor Jerry mentioned that God didn't start sexuality with a negative command. And the example that he mentioned was only half of the positive, though, right? When God said, be fruitful and multiply, it refers to the reproductive aspect of sex. Now, let me get a little heady, cerebral here, all right? Go with me. Yahweh was bringing order to chaos, introducing himself as the progenitor of procreation, as someone who wants more humans, if you will. He wants to bring order to human civilization. And Israel's neighbors, all right, they had their own gods, and their gods weren't really filling humans the majority of the time. But Yahweh wanted more humans, not less of them. He says they were created in his own image, that they spread his glory and likeness over his creation, that they helped him cultivate what he'd made. God wanted humans to join him in bringing order to the world, including within the context of love and marriage. Song of Solomon comes along and helps us see that procreation isn't the only positive that God provides surrounding sex. It offers a robust perspective. See, this book doesn't even mention procreation. It talks a lot about sex. There's no children in sight. Sex is only seen as recreation. It's purpose, enjoyment, pleasure, and the unity that a married couple experiences because of it. That's why Solomon uses so much extravagance to define his experience. Blew the roof off his anything he could have imagined. It was like he was imagining, it's the promised land. And for us, I don't want to get too far into the specifics. There are parts of our anatomy that don't serve any reproductive purpose. They are only for that because God, in all of his infinite wisdom, has intricately wired our bodies to fully enjoy through these illegitimate means. It's a lie, and it's never going to be better for you. That's the lie that he started saying in the garden, and it's the lie he'll continue saying until his head gets crushed. Finally. And God wants you to be free. And so if you're struggling with shame in any way or for any reason, remember that there's no condemnation, there's no judgment, there's no in Jesus. None. Our divine husband sings over us even on our worst days. Yes, God wants us to love him. He wants us to obey him, but he doesn't see you like you sometimes see yourself. Let him remind you of your union with Christ, and let him heal you. Now, this has some overlap with this next invitation. To some, Jesus is saying, come away and let me hear you. Let me hear you. You might be feeling like you're wandering in the wilderness of singleness, like God's just left you out to dry, that he's forgotten about you. But I know marriage, spouses, there may be some who are a little bit upset, who are grieving that marriage isn't exactly the promised land that you'd been hoping for. And you might feel like God's left you there, that he's forsaken you. Maybe there's been a breakup or a divorce, the passing away of a spouse. Maybe you're having frustration with your season or frustration with this series. Jesus is calling out to all of us, regardless of what you're experiencing, regardless of the context, to come away, to be vulnerable, to entrust your emotions to him and to lament, to rage, to cry out to him, to let him hear you. And this might be something that requires a little bit of work. It might require a little bit more. Maybe you need to invite a few people from your community in to let them counsel you. Maybe you need to consider professional help and a counselor. But regardless, don't neglect the counselor. Whatever you decide to do, come away with the King throughout each step of that process. Before, during, and after, make sure to make space to commune with your King and let him hear you. For others, Lastly, Jesus might be saying, come away and let me have you. Now, maybe you aren't really experiencing much right now, but you know you'd benefit from like a good late night prayer session. You know what I'm saying? Like you put on some some R&B type worship, and you let Montel Fish just sing over you how wonderful our God is. Maybe you, like Miss Terry, you have a special touch from God where you're recognizing just how good it is for him to see your situation, for him to be flexing his power in what you're experiencing and knowing that he's not left you out to dry there. Maybe you aren't making enough space to cultivate a deep intimacy with God. Najee once shared something that a friend told him, that God doesn't share the deep secrets of his heart to those who are in the drive-through line. I hope that baby's here soon. If it's not, maybe it already is. Maybe someone out there can't say, like Solomon said, that you've captivated my heart. Maybe there's something that you're holding on to and unwilling to let go of. Maybe there's something that you haven't surrendered to God. Regardless, we'd all benefit from a Sabbath, a space to delight in God, to slow down long enough to hear from him, to enjoy him, and to enjoy the gifts that he gives with him in mind. Whatever it is, come away with the King. Let him heal you, let him hear you, and let him have you. At our first ever marriage conference a few years back, the husbands were asked to get up and to affirm their wives, and it was one at a time. And so there was kind of this air in the room of like nervousness, or like who's going next, and not knowing what to expect. And I'll never forget this moment when the atmosphere in the room kind of shifted. Dave Dawkins stood up and he looked at Kelly and he said, "She's my Saturday." And Kelly wept, and I'm pretty sure a ton of other people in the room, some were caught off guard and some were like, man, that was nice. But he described her as his rest. And that's what God gives to us when he brings order to things that are otherwise chaotic without him, including love. You know, the passage describes the order for love, the process of awakening it, this morning routine, if you will, and it included a ceremony, Sabbathing together, and consummation. But there's another layer to this, though. We don't know up here on the stage and as a staff, we don't know all the situations, all the pains, all the desires of those who are listening. We see some of them, but we can't address everything. And even more, we can't fully understand all that you're experiencing, that you're grieving, that you're desiring. Jesus does, though. Our King, our groom, is calling out to his bride, come away with me. Come away with me. Let me heal you. Let me hear you. Let me have you. So on top of the practical wisdom to pull today, come away with the King. Come away with the King. At Disciple City, we have a time of contemplation where we ask a few questions. They're most likely on your screen. We ask, what is God calling you to stop? What is God calling you to start? And what is God calling you to believe? That kicker then is, who's God calling you to share this with? And this morning we're going to take a few seconds to sit, to slow down enough to hear from God and answer these questions. I love y'all. your name. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. Is resurrecting me. Man, made for love, you know. There's a lot to it, but I'm grateful that God's given us a book to mine the depths of what love is, to give us a tangible picture that celebrates a romantic relationship in the context of a community and how community is involved in that, because it points back to this deep, endless well of life-giving love that God has for us. And coming up on July 17th at 9 a.m., there is an event for our women put on by the Women's Ministry where they are going to continue their study of Ephesians, and they will be addressing the topic, I am loved. Unless I'm missing something, I'm not missing something, I see it there. I am loved. And so I hope, ladies, that you will participate. I remember one time Jorge was like running sound, and so he got to participate. So fellas, if you don't want to feel left out, maybe you just hit up Miss Annie and the team, and they have a way you can serve and be a part. It's a Zoom, though, so I don't think anybody's running the sound. All that to say, ladies, if you can make space, July 17th, 9 a.m., it will be virtual, and hopefully at some point in the near future, we'll get all the things done we need to get done for this building so we can have everyone here in these pews, in this building. It's such a gift. If you want to get here before that time, you can serve. You can hit up Jorge about how to serve in the back. You can hit up Jorge about how to serve up here on the platform. You can hit us up in any way, and we would love to have you make the live stream work. I heard it was glitching. I hope that you were still able to get through. But, man, give it up wherever you are this morning. Give it up for those who are in the back, the technical team, those who are doing production. Give it up for these two up here killing it. I love the depiction that you don't need a huge band and all of the pieces. You simply need a posture of worship. So thank you guys again for that. And we love y'all. Let me bless you as you're on your way out this morning. May the love of God and the sweet communion of his Holy Spirit go with his people now and forevermore. Let all God's people say, amen, amen. Go like hug a neighbor or something, you know what I'm saying? Pretty soon. Go text somebody that don't look like you, you know. We'll get it. We'll figure it out.